Typical coil pack problems can just ruin your confidence in your car. It can cause breakdowns, poor running, and a whole host of other issues. And it can also run on to create issues and problems in other areas of the car that are a lot more expensive to fix. So knowing how a coil pack works, what they do, why we have coil packs, and the typical symptoms that happen when they start to fail will better prepare us as drivers to jump in and fix the problem. So we're going to look at answers to those questions. How do you know when a coil pack is starting to fail in your car? And we're also going to look at some of the methods that you can use to easily identify and verify which of the coil packs is causing the problem. So it's the spark from the spark plug that ignites the fuel and creates the power within the engine. If you've got a conventional engine, if you've got a diesel, this obviously doesn't apply to you. They don't use sparks at all. But in order to get that spark to jump the gap at the end of the plug, you need somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 volts. But you've only got a 12-volt car battery. So what you need to do is step up that voltage. So that really is where the coil pack comes into its own. And the coil pack, think of it as a sort of reverse transformer that you use at home to charge your mobile phone. So the mains voltage coming into your house is far too high for your phone. So a little transformer uses coils to step down the voltage and the power, so it's at an accessible level for you to charge your phone. So within the engine, the reverse is happening. The 12 volts is being stepped up to the required 20 to 50,000 volts in order to create that little jump. So right at the beginning, I'm putting this little safety announcement, never to unplug or touch anything associated with the ignition system while the engine is running. The high voltages that you get from the ignition system can cause serious injury or even death if you're not careful. So it's always best to just switch the engine off completely when you unplug things or when you start poking around inside this area of the engine. So years ago, we used to have a single coil from the battery that would step the voltage up, and then it would go to the spark plug by means of a distributor, which would send this high voltage down what we used to call high tension leads to the spark plug. Now, that was fairly cheap. You only had one coil. It was fairly easy to diagnose a problem with that coil, but there were a lot of problems and challenges that came from that original setup. There are lots of advantages by switching to a coil pack system, and that's really what modern manufacturers have actually done. So the problems you used to have was the high voltage was traveling a long way inside the engine bay. So that would often cause electromagnetic interference. It can affect the readings from other sensors if wires are in the wrong place. If the wire themselves that's carrying that high voltage is damaged in some way, and that was quite a common occurrence under the engine with all the vibrations going on, that would quite easily short out and cause all sorts of problems. So it makes sense really to have the voltage stepped up at the very last point in the chain just before the actual spark plug. So that really is why we've got these coil packs or coil on plug systems to amplify the current, and they're now located right above the spark plug. The other advantage is there's less resistance encountered. The electricity has a much shorter path to travel. It's not running around the entire length of your engine bay. It's just going from the coil to the plug itself. So what causes them to fail? Surely it's just a little coil of wire and there's not a lot of scope there for it to fail. Well, you're right in thinking that there's not a lot of scope for it to fail. But bear in mind that within the engine, you are subject to all sorts of vibrations, all sorts of stresses. The engine gets very hot, it cools as well. So the expansion and contraction caused on the metal from heat can create stresses and weaknesses within the metal that actually causes it to break down. As well as the coil itself, you've got the insulation around it that stops that high voltage from tracking out to earth on the car. And that insulation will start to break down with age, like all of us really. So as things get older, it certainly makes sense to look for these potential problems and replace them early on before they start creating an issue. So the problems you will get from a coil pack is typically no spark at all on that particular cylinder, an intermittent spark. So when the coil pack is under particular load at high RPM driving, for example, or it's been subject to extreme stress, maybe the engine and the coil pack itself has got really hot, maybe it's an extremely cold morning. Anything that's outside of those normal operating temperatures can just push a slightly dodgy coil pack into the point where it's not working. The really hard thing to track down is where there is an intermittent fault, where you get a spark some of the time, but at other times you don't get any spark at all, or you get a very, very weak spark causing a very incomplete burn within the engine. So things to look out for is rough running, misfires, loss of power when accelerating, little gaps in the power band where you put your foot down and just nothing happens. They're often caused by a coil pack starting to play up. You might notice as well that the fuel economy has started to seriously dip. It's well below what you were expecting from that car, and you've not particularly changed your driving style or the way the car's used. So again, that could be down to the coil pack. You may even have a warning light, a check engine light, or the engine check light on your dashboard telling you there is a problem within the engine. So for some drivers, that's often the first symptom they will get, that there is a coil pack problem, because they've not noticed the rough running, the poor fuel economy happening, or the loss of power that has happened. And then another thing is often difficulty starting. It obviously depends what the sort of degradation is on the coil pack itself, but it can make the car very, very difficult to start on those particularly cold mornings as well. So once again, I just emphasize the risk of working on the high voltage parts of the car ignition system. Be very careful. Make sure the engine is off before you start touching and poking around inside there. So where do you go to start diagnosing this problem? Is it in fact a problem with the coil pack, or is it just a bad spark plug, or is the issue somewhere else in the engine? Well, firstly, with any fault or problem on the car, particularly one that fires up a warning light on the dashboard, you really need to read the error codes off the OBD2 port. There's lots of little plug-in modules that read these codes, and a lot of them will connect to your mobile phone. They're fairly inexpensive, and they've certainly generally paid themselves by the time you've taken your car to a garage and paid them to run a full diagnostic. And it can save a bit of time because you'll often know what the problem is. You may even be able to fix it very simply yourself at home. And in the case of coil packs, it is a fairly simple swap to do at home. So you don't really need to pay the mechanic if that indeed is what the problem is. So the error codes will generally indicate there is a misfire on one of the cylinders. So it's detected a problem. You'll usually get the misfire on just one cylinder, but it may be on 2 or 3 cylinders. So coil packs are one of those things when one starts to go, the others can often go at the same time. They've had the same amount of stress. They've come from the same batch from the factory. So their lifespan is fairly common among them, unless there is some particular reason why one has particularly failed. So as the mileage starts creeping up, if you've got a single coil pack issue, it might be advisable to go out and replace all the coil packs, but they're relatively expensive, so you might want to hold back a little bit before you do that. Look at the mileage of the car. Is it an abnormal early failure that you're experiencing, or are they reaching the end of their lifespan? So that answer may well determine whether you invest in a complete set of coil packs for your car. So you found an error, a misfire on, say, cylinder 1. If you then take that coil pack out and you swap it with cylinder 2, don't swap the leads that connect to it, obviously. We are just swapping out the coil pack, the bit that amplifies the spark to the spark plug. So if you start the car and you read the error codes now and the problem has moved to cylinder 2, that's almost certainly a problem with that coil pack. So that's one of the easiest ways of determining without too much of a doubt that the coil pack that you had in your hand was the one that was causing the problem. It's handy as well to just visually inspect the coil packs, to take them out of the car one by one. It's important, obviously, to get all of the parts in the car in the correct cylinder order. Otherwise, you're going to have all sorts of problems, and it is a nightmare trying to work out which plug lead goes to which without resorting to online technical manuals. So if you're fairly new to this, I would strongly recommend you just do them one at a time, and you keep careful track of which lead was going to which cylinder. This will go a long way to avoiding the problems you get where voltage is directed at completely the wrong cylinder at the wrong time. When you inspect the coil pack, you're looking for obvious damage, wear, tear, bad insulation somewhere along there. There may even be signs of sparking or scoring, little soot tracks that have been left on the plastic. So that can obviously help to flag up the problem with the insulation on the coil pack itself. And the other way really is to just get a multimeter and to connect that to the plus and minus terminals on the coil pack and just read off the resistance, and just to make sure that that is within the correct parameters. So there's a little bit of variation. The manufacturers sometimes use different resistance coil packs, and you just need to be aware of what the expected range is for your particular coil pack. If you set your multimeter to the 200 ohms range, and then you connect the probes to the primary terminals on the top of the coil pack. You're looking for a resistance of between 0.3 and 1 ohms. But do check the workshop manuals or your online references to your specific engine to just make sure that's within tolerances. And actually just comparing across the different plugs you've got can sometimes indicate there is a problem with one of the plugs. So if you don't have access to that information as to what a normal reading is, look at all of the coil packs that you've got and use that to establish a baseline of what's expected, and abnormalities will generally show themselves up quite quickly. You can actually get coil on plug ignition testers. You can get little ones that will just tell you if there is a spark happening. There's lots of diagnostic equipment out there. It's often hard for a driver that doesn't really want to fill their garage up with all these different tools and things to justify the investment in buying these additional parts. So if you've got a multimeter, that's actually a very, very versatile tool. If you've got an OBD2 port code reader, that'll go a long way to saving money on garage bills and just helping you to determine where those faults are. So hopefully now, if you've got a problem with your coil pack, you're able to determine that it is a problem with the coil pack. You're able to find which coil pack is causing the problem, and you're now able to go and get a replacement and swap them out, and your engine will be running as smooth as anything. So please boot that like button if you've enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments what experiences you've had with engines with coil packs. A lot of different brands have certainly had a reputation for coil packs failing prematurely. I'd be curious if you help me to build up a picture as to what those common faults are with different manufacturers and different engines. Please subscribe if you haven't done so. We would love you to stay tuned to the channel. And I've lined this video up for you that you should find really interesting if you just want to get the best out of your engine.